2 years ago this week, came home from work. Hadn't really even gotten a chance to take my coat off. I walked in and Gail got a phone call, and it was Jed's football coach had called and said that he had collapsed on the field and he wasn't responding. When I got there, the team was still on the field and they were working on Jed. They ultimately brought out an AED and hooked that up to him. And I just remember it feeling surreal. I was like, is this really happening? Knelt down, prayed for him, and just, I guess, tried to take it all in. I went and followed all the ambulance to the hospital, not knowing what I would find when I got there. When I got there, I found out that he had started breathing on the way, but it had been pretty rough on him. The resuscitation efforts did a lot of damage, and he had been without oxygen for quite a long time. But they brought him into the hospital room, and we spent the next 5 days just waiting. Over that week at the hospital, I had a lot of friends, a lot of phone calls, and they helped me really process what was going on. The way I've said it is they each gave me a piece that I started to put together as like the narrative of what I knew was true. The first night, one of the guys that was there, I just said, I don't think I've got the faith to do this. And he gave me a hug and just said, we'll be your faith. And I've had started doubting, man, is Jed all right? Is he, he had accepted the Lord at 5 and I baptized him. He was so excited to be baptized. I got a chance to baptize him. That was a fun day. But as a parent, you just start wondering and worrying. And my friend said Jed was God's man and started reminding me of some things about his life. And I found that to be true as the weeks went on and we started hearing stories and realized the impact that he'd had with friends at school and family members. And I realized, no, he was a godly man. And even at 15, he was making a difference in people's lives. And that's a huge gift to me. So over the course of those days, there was a lot of praying and but ultimately a realization that the time without oxygen was just too long, and that he ultimately passed on November 1st. So over those next few weeks, I really had to naturally wrestle with the idea of why would you allow this? How is this possible? This has happened. I had to get to a place where I can open my hands and realize that God has given me beautiful things, and he may do things from time to time that wouldn't be what I choose, and that I could trust that what he has planned for me is better than I would come up with. And what does it come down to? Am I going to trust God or am I going to trust me? And we had to make a decision early on to be open with the fact that this is painful. I think one of the challenges could be is like, if I'm vulnerable, somebody says, how's it going? And the temptation is like, oh, things are good. It's fine. And to say, no, it's not really fine. This is what, to be vulnerable, to let people see the pain you're going through. Psalm 119, a friend of mine shared that. And it says that you've put your precepts in my heart. And then he says, and God, put your hand on my shoulder and steady me, and put steel in my soul. And if I should wander, come after me, and I'll hear the sound of your voice. I think about that, and I think how true that is. It's like, I know what's true. God, I need you to steady me, and I need you to strengthen me. And I think we have to be okay with, and we say that around here at the church, it's okay to not be okay. That's not a cliche. That is who we are. We're not okay. We're broken and we're wrestling through life, and we get a chance to hold each other up and encourage one another. That's what we're supposed to do. And the other side of that is if we don't walk through it, it has power over us. It's like a stronghold in our life that can be a foothold for the enemy to to beat us up. And instead, I get to disarm the enemy because I get to talk about it and say, you know what, that thing doesn't have power in my life because I know what's true. I have a God who is bigger than this. And ultimately, I know he is good and what he has given me is beautiful.
I'm not sure how many of you know Kevin and Gail and their daughter, Abby. Kevin oversees the finance and administration here at the church. And over the last 2 years, I've watched them go through something that is every parent's worst nightmare. You don't know how you'd survive something like that. And I've watched them grieve in such a deep but godly manner. And here's what I'm seeing in Kevin is a wound is slowly over time healing into a scar. And there's years of healing and years of grief still ahead of them. But over the last couple of weeks, we've been looking at the series, we're calling it Scars, and just this reality that life is tough. Oh, I wish I could guarantee us that the Bible teaches that if you're a follower of Jesus, you're immune to pain and tragedy and loss, but that's not the case. Every story you read in here are people who have gone through just this reality of what humans face every day, loss, pain. And the question then is do my wounds stay wounds, or do my wounds over time and through the grace of God and through my hard work eventually become a scar? Because a wound on your body, if it stays open, it's always vulnerable. And we can cover them up, but if they don't heal, there's always this sense of pain, and there's this sense of vulnerability. And God wants our physical bodies to heal, but he wants our hearts to heal as well, where we move from wounds to scars. And over the past couple of weeks, we've looked at a couple of really important things. One is Jesus being a scarred Savior. That when Jesus appears after his resurrection, astoundingly, he still has scars. In Revelation chapter 5, he's described as the Lamb who looks like he was slain, standing in the middle of the throne. Meaning he still bears upon his body the scars of crucifixion. Jesus, when he appears to his disciples in the end of John, he has the scars where the nails were, where the spear was thrust into his side. Last week, we looked at the Apostle Paul, a guy who writes 2/3 of the New Testament, and he walks us through all of the things that he's faced, attempted executions, ongoing imprisonment, and then he talks about the emotional weight and pain that he has, and he says, I'm willing to share my scars. I am willing because it's part of the human existence, but there's this beautiful passage in Galatians chapter 6 where Paul says this, I bear on my body the marks of Christ. Meaning he has renamed his scars. He doesn't deny them. He doesn't pretend like it didn't happen. He just says, when you see this scar in my soul, it's not associated with a person. It's not associated with an event or a trauma. He says, I've renamed these scars. This is where Jesus taught me that he heals. This is where I learned all about Jesus and his mercy. This is where I learned that he can forgive anything. So can we change the names of the scars of our lives and say, these are the marks of Jesus. This is where he taught me. Not have to hide our scars or pretend that they weren't there or cover them with our shame if they're self-inflicted. Can we change our scars? Here's how I want to wrap up this series. I want to look at a man who has every right to have a lot of wounds at the end of his life. His name's Joseph. And we find his story in the book of Genesis, which is the first book in the Bible. And Genesis, up to this point, has covered centuries of human history and kind of looked at people very briefly. But from chapter 29 all the way to chapter 50, there's this just all this information about the life of this one man. So God gives a tremendous amount of detail into the life of Joseph. And I think one of the reasons he does that is so that we could learn some lessons about how to no longer be wounded, but eventually come to a place where we have scars rather than wounds. Because Joseph has been through it all. Like briefly, we can't get into details. We don't have it's not chronicled how Joseph felt at different times. But I just want to give you an outline, a part of what his life was like. And then he is going to give us 5 lessons on how to move from being wounded to scarred. Okay? And I don't pretend that any of this happens overnight. I do not suggest that this is easy, but that miracle is available, and God wants to do that in our lives. Here's a bit of Joseph's life. Family of origin. If your family of origin was dysfunctional and odd, listen to this. His dad's name is Jacob. And Jacob, it just gets weird from the very beginning. Jacob wants to marry a girl named Rachel, and so he works for his deceptive father-in-law for 7 years to marry Rachel. And his father-in-law Laban switches wives the night of the wedding, and when Jacob wakes up in the morning, he's like, that's not who I intended to marry after their honeymoon night. Instead, he married Leah, the older sister. So then he works another 7 years. And so then, as weird as your family was, Joseph's father is married to 2 sisters. And both of them are unhappy and are competing with each other, and it's just super disharmony, a home filled with disharmony. And then the sisters are constantly competing with who can produce the most children and potential heirs. And so both of the sisters ask their husband Jacob to marry their maids. And so now in Joseph's family, there are 4 different mothers and 1 father, and there's all this rivalry. In their home, there's constant deception and trickery. And then you get into stories of vigilantism, where there's mass murder involved, there's sexual violation. I mean, it just goes on and on. It is so messy. And then poor Joseph, he's born into this family. He's got 11 brothers, and they all come from these different moms. And some of them are more valuable than others in his father's eyes, Jacob's eyes. But he looks at Joseph, who comes from his favorite wife. It's just never good to have a favorite wife, okay, when you've got 4. They make TV shows about this, don't they? And so Jacob, looking at his 12 sons, goes, man, I love Joseph. He's the best. And he's one of the younger ones. So in that culture, the older you were, the more honored you should be. And so Jacob, as a flawed father, begins to show this unhealthy favoritism. And he actually makes an outfit, an ornate jacket or robe for Joseph to wear. It's called the coat of many colors. So in a day and age when color to dye things was nearly impossible, and it was a sign of value and wealth, and really the only people who had anything that was not gray was royalty, Jacob spends a tremendous amount of money and says, hey, I want everybody to know, including his brothers, that Joseph is my favorite son, and I'm going to give him a special jacket, and I want him to wear it all the time. And when he walks around, it's this hey, I'm dad's favorite. Well, what does that do for him? Well, his brothers hate him, right? They just absolutely hate him. And one time, 11 of the brothers are off working in the fields, and 9 of his brothers turn on him and go, you know what, we're going to kill you. We hate you so much. We are going to kill our brother. One brother stands up, a guy named Reuben. He goes, no, let's not kill him. We don't want that on our hands. But let's just beat him up and throw him into a cistern, an empty well. And so they beat him up, throw him into a cistern, and they're sitting around having lunch. And you can imagine, here's Joseph, the bottom of a well. His brothers just turn on him. He's calling out, guys, get me out. This isn't fair. And along come a group of Midianite slave traders. And so his brothers all look at each other and they go, you know what? This is perfect. Let's sell our brother into human trafficking. So they sell their brother as a slave. Then they have this whole pretense where they take this jacket and they put goat's blood on it and tell Jacob, their father, that, hey, your favorite son, was killed by a wild animal. He's dead. I'm so sorry. So here's Joseph then. He enters into this life as it's no longer privileged, but as a slave. He eventually goes to Egypt. And in Egypt, he's put on an auction block. And he's purchased by a man named Potiphar, who's a very wealthy Egyptian. And then for the next 7.5 years, he lives as a slave. All freedom, all dignity, stripped from his life. But he's thriving. And there's this little description of Joseph. It says Joseph was well-built and handsome. And so his master's wife, Potiphar's wife, looks at him and decides that she wants to seduce him. And he says no. Like he just maintains his integrity, and it goes on. And eventually he has to flee. She takes his jacket. She makes up a whole story that he had tried to abuse her. So now the guy who did the right thing is sent to prison, an Egyptian dungeon. And for the next 6.5 years, 7.5 years as a slave, 6.5 years as a prisoner, a dark, dank prison, he stays in that prison cell accused of a crime that he did not commit. And by the way, he's betrayed by some friends in the prison. Now, we move all the way, this is now years and years later, 13 years later, and Joseph has always had this gift from God that he has these visions, and he can interpret people's visions as God's trying to communicate to humans through visions. And so Pharaoh, like the head of the empire of Egypt, the most powerful force in the land, has a dream. Eventually, Joseph ends up as a prisoner interpreting the dream. And the dream basically is this: that in the future, God's giving this warning. There are going to be 7 years of plenty, where there's going to be a lot of rain. There's going to be an abundance. But following that are going to be 7 years of extensive and extreme drought. So Pharaoh says, hey, this guy that can tell me my dream, I'm going to put you in charge. And so Joseph oversees these 7 years of plenty, storing grain, creating storage, rationing food, so that when this drought comes, he's actually able to survive, and the entire nation survives this extensive drought. I mean, here's a guy abused, mistreated, sold into slavery, wrongly imprisoned, 13 years of his life. And yet, we have these glimpses, Genesis chapter 50. When you get to the end of his life, he's going to encounter his brothers 22 years later. 22 years later. And 22 years later, here's what we see about Joseph. He's not a wounded man, he's a scarred man. So here's what I want to learn. I do not want to remain wounded the rest of my life, because I see firsthand in my life, and I see in our lives what that does. If there's somebody in the Bible that can teach me how to move from being wounded to being scarred, I want to learn that. So here's 5 lessons from the life of Joseph that help us move from being wounded people to scarred people. And there's a lot of time that takes place here, okay? This was not overnight. But these are the principles that God leaves for us from the life of Joseph. Number 1 principle, if you want to move from being wounded to being scarred, is this: understand that I cannot control what happens to me, but I can control who I will be. So Joseph has no control over the family that he's born into. He has no control over the dysfunction that his father exhibits. He has no control that there's 4 moms and 1 dad and all this sibling rivalry. He had no control when his brothers turn on him, when they throw him into a well. He had no control as a slave. He has even less control as a prisoner. He has no control for 13 years over the circumstances of his life. And here's the lesson for you and I. You and I cannot control what happens to us. There will be things that happen that you did not plan or anticipate. You had no control over the family you were born into. You had no control over that person in your life. We just don't have any control. But here's what's important. You have to maintain your dignity. And you maintain your dignity by saying this: I am in control over how I respond. I am always in control over how I respond. I can't determine what will happen to me. But what I can do is I can determine who I will be in the midst of everything that happens. Read together with me from Genesis. This is this picture of he's not in control, but he's control of who he is. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered. By the way, we're going to come back to this. This is the most often repeated phrase in the story of Joseph for 31 chapters. The Lord was with Joseph, wherever he's at, so that he prospered. This is while he is a slave. And he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food that he ate. Here's a guy who could have said, I am a victim. I'm a victim of the family I was born into. I was a victim of the abuse I suffered from my family. I'm a victim now as a slave. But this is what Joseph did. And I think this is so important. And please, I'm not being insensitive, but we have to understand this. I can't control what happens, but I can control how I respond. I can control, will I choose in my life of slavery? You could have just sat there. Joseph could have done the bare minimum and just thought like everything that he lost. And I bet there were months or maybe years where he did that. But eventually, as a slave, he looks around and he says, I still have this shred of dignity. I can be the best slave that Potiphar has ever had. And I'm going to apply myself. And here's what God does. God blesses Joseph. Because Joseph says, I can't live in the past. I can't live with this open wound. I'm going to move forward and I'm going to trust God. I can't control what happens next, but I can control every decision I make. I can control and hold on to my integrity. I can say no. I can make right choices, even if I can't control my destiny. You cannot control what happens to you, but I am in control. I am still responsible for how I respond. Here's the second thing from the life of Joseph. If you want to be scarred rather than wounded, you have to fight for forgiveness. Fight for forgiveness. And please know, I use this word very intentionally. Sometimes we paint forgiveness as this like easy thing and you just like press through. I think when you have been incredibly wounded, you're in for one of the greatest fights, one of the greatest battles of your life. Because here's the tendency. I can stay focused on the perpetrator. I can stay focused on my decision, whatever it was that caused the wound. I did this, they did this, and you can be stuck and there's this ongoing reality of potential bitterness within my life. And somehow Joseph finds a way to fight for forgiveness. And forgiveness, please hear me, forgiveness is not an emotion. Forgiveness is not when I look at the person who harmed me and I just think, I love you. Maybe one day. But forgiveness is when I say, I no longer allow that wound to determine my destiny. I no longer allow that person to have power over me. I no longer have so much shame because of the decision I made that I'm stuck there. I am giving retribution over to God. I am giving justice over to God. And I'm going to fight through the years for forgiveness. Let me show you the end result of his fight for forgiveness. This is 22 years later when his brothers, who are now dealing with the famine that happened, they need to save their family. So guess where they go? They go to Egypt. And when they come into Joseph's presence, Joseph now dresses like an Egyptian. He looks like an Egyptian. They have no idea who he is. And Joseph ends up saving their lives, saving the entire Hebrew line. But when they realize that this is Joseph, like they realize this guy is so powerful now, he could snap his fingers and execute all of us. This is what Joseph says to him. 22 years of working through the process of forgiveness. And now, do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. 22 years of fighting for forgiveness, and when he finally sees his brothers, he weeps because it still hurts. We didn't read that. It says he weeps and he cries, but when he has an opportunity to get them back, to even the score, what does he say? Somehow, over the last 22 years, I've dealt with all the pain that you've caused me. The pain of your personal rejection, your decisions led me to 13 years of slavery and imprisonment. And I have a scar where I used to have a wound. And you don't have to be afraid of me because I've let it go. And I realized that no matter how difficult the journey was, I'm here and God sent me ahead of you. And this was not the route I wanted to take. Nonetheless, I've let it go. Ladies and gentlemen, one of the things that will keep me wounded is the inability to forgive, and I do not trivialize this. It is perhaps one of the greatest fights that you will ever fight, is that learning how to let things go. Jesus had these radical concepts on forgiveness. He asks us to forgive the unforgivable. He models this. He forgives those who offend him. And it is this hard work, the process of letting go. You'll need help with it. You'll need to pray over it. You'll need a miracle, but you have to fight for forgiveness or your wound never heals. Here's a third principle from the life of Joseph. What seems pointless is often preparation. Okay, what seems pointless is often preparation. When Joseph first enters into slavery, like what a waste, right? What a waste of a good life. When he ends up in prison for 6.5 years, what a waste. These are not prisons where they're trying to rehabilitate you. They're not teaching you like skills for life. This is like where you go to be punished. And this is years and years of like, what a life. Like, do I even want to live if this is my reality? I have no freedom. I feel no dignity, all of this. And here's what Joseph never imagined, and what we never imagined, is that what sometimes seems pointless or even seems like punishment is actually a form of preparation. Let's read together from Genesis. So the warden of the prison, put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. Sounds really similar to when he was a slave. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. So here's Joseph's life. Okay, you kind of figured out how to be the upper echelon slave, and now you're in prison. And guess what needs to happen in prison? The latrine needs to be emptied. People need to be fed. You need to figure out systems. And Joseph, like, I'm going to do the best I can. I'm going to bloom wherever I'm planted. And apparently I'm planted in prison, in a dungeon. And so he just begins to administrate this prison, just like he was administrating Potiphar's home. And I bet there was not a moment in his life where he said, man, I'm so glad I'm in jail because I'm learning some great lessons. I'm really honing my administrative skills. This is fantastic. But a few years later, here's a man that would be responsible for the world's greatest empire at the time, to collect food, distribute food, store food, and to get millions of people through one of the most severe famines they'd ever seen. Where did he learn all that administrative work? As a slave and as a prisoner. But I'll tell you what, when you're in the midst of it, it doesn't feel like preparation. It feels like punishment. It feels like chaos. It feels like this is just, why is this happening to me? Let me give you a quick example. Here's a job I had for 5 years getting through college. I worked at a publishing house, and my job was to take all the books that didn't sell, they'd put them on big pallets and wrap them up, box them back up, they'd ship them back to the publishing house. And I had to open every one of those boxes, and I had to take out the book, and every book had already been stickered because it was in a retail setting. I had to pull the sticker off, and I had to take acetone in a rag and wipe off all remnants of glue, okay? 40 hours a week for 5 years. Just like, I hated my job. I just hated it. Like pallets of books, and you put them, clean, acetone. I was like, this is the most pointless job imaginable. And my first couple years, I didn't do a great job at it. My first year, I pretty much I sat there at a desk, so I listened to talk radio. It just made me angry. Anybody ever do that? You listen to talk angry? Like, I wasn't angry, but then I just listened to people and political opinions, and I'm just like, I'm mad. Now I'm mad. Mad about everything. About a year of that, and I'm like, that's probably not the best, so I'm just going to listen to music. It was like 1992. I was kind of having a hard time leaving the 80s, still had a mullet. I've always been kind of a metal guy. And then, so, here's the other thing, like 8 hours of Metallica. Not necessarily good for the soul either, so I tried that for a year. And then about 3 years into it, I'm like, hey, what if I just tried to make the best of this? And so I had this radio at my little return booth, and I just tuned in, and I tried to find out when all the different preaching was on, okay? So FM, AM, I had a whole schedule. It was a list, like Alistair Begg, Chuck Swindoll, when they teach, I'm just changing. Now I'm listening, and I'm trying to do it so I don't listen to as much Metallica, okay? It wasn't like this noble thing. I was like, I got to do something better. And here's what I had no idea about for 3 years. Not 3 years. I listened to people teach and explain the Bible, and it was maybe the best preparation for what God would one day have me to do. I never anticipated it at the time. I was just mad at every sticker on every book. But what God was doing is, Nate, let me teach you the Bible. At the time, it was pointless. But you give it 30 years and you're like, dear God, that was preparation. I felt stuck. But you were doing something I could never anticipate. And here's what I want you to understand. What seems pointless in your life, it makes no sense. I guarantee you that there is a God who is using whatever is happening in your life to prepare you for something in the future. Here's the next principle. Principle number 4 from the life of Joseph. No matter how bad it seems, I am not alone. If there's one thing you walked away with, I would want it to be this. No matter how bad it seems. This is the phrase that comes up over and over and over in the life of Joseph. The Lord was with him when he was in the bottom of a cistern. The Lord is with him the entire time he's a slave. The Lord is with him the entire time he's in prison. And the Lord is with him the entire time he is one of the most powerful people in all of Egypt. Here's the question we have. When something bad happens to us, it is a natural question. You ask it, I ask it. If something happens where I am wounded, the first thing I say is, God, where are you? How could you have allowed this to happen to me? You must not care. You must not be involved. You must be so distant because I can't see you. I can't feel you. I can't sense you. And how many times do you think Joseph felt exactly that? When he's shackled and riding in a cart, when he's standing on an auction block being sold into slavery, when he's mistreated, when he's thrown into jail for doing the right thing, how many nights do you think Joseph said, God, where are you? How could this happen? And here's what the biblical author says over and over. You cannot avoid seeing it. It says, and God was with him. In the bottom of a pit, in a dark prison cell, as a slave, and God was with him. God was with him. Let's read together. Genesis. But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. I just want you to put your life in there. While you were brokenhearted, going through the divorce, trying to recover from childhood, trying to figure out how to get back on your feet, the Lord was with you. When I felt hopeless and life was pointless and I had so much shame, the Lord was with you. The Lord was with him. And he showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warrior. Here's what I know. I cannot guarantee what our future holds, what your future, my future holds. I can guarantee one thing, that Jesus stood in front of his disciples and made them a promise. He said, I will never leave or forsake you. No matter how good or how painful life might be. That is the one thing that we can hold on to. When you don't feel him, when you don't see him, when you don't sense him, he is there in the midst of it all. Here's the fifth and final principle from Joseph's life. Absolutely nothing can thwart God's plan. Absolutely nothing. So one thing that we haven't talked about is when we're introduced to Joseph early on, he's this young man, probably somewhere from 14 to 17 years old, and he has his first dream. And in his dream, all of his brothers are showing him gratitude. They're like, you're amazing, you're amazing. So in his multicolored coat, he goes and tells his brothers, hey guys, I had 2 dreams, and you guys all looked up to me and worshiped me. Didn't help, right? Didn't help that sibling rivalry, part of how you end up in a well. And they're like, are you kidding me? But early on, God had given him this dream that there was something unique and specific that his life was meant to be and to accomplish one day. Well, it's 22 years later, and it happens. It happens. Let's read this. Nothing can thwart God's plan. But Joseph said to them, these are his brothers again, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me. When you threw me in that cistern, when you sold me into slavery, every intention of your heart was to destroy me, to cause me pain, to cause me trauma, to make it so that I could never recover. But God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. He looks at his brothers and he says this, you sold me, but God sent me. You sold me, but God sent me. There is this idea that I think you have to have if you ever want wounds to turn into scars, is that God is never done. You cannot thwart, interrupt God's plan for your life. There's no decision that I've made that is so grievous and so broken that God says, that's it. I can't work with that. I'm never too far gone. There's nothing that happens to you. There's no trauma that is bigger than God, where God says, okay, I see what's happened. God gives this amazing thing called free will, which is a gift. The problem with free will is people use their will to harm others. And sometimes I use my will to harm myself. And God says, I'm going to let you make some choices. And I'll let the people around you make choices. But those choices can never interfere or disrupt my plans for your life. We might take a little bit longer. It may be a circuitous route. It might be 22 years before you get to the place where God said, this is where we were headed all along. I remember when I was a kid, I had this pastor. His name was Pastor Douglas. And I remember almost nothing. I don't know why this stuck with me, but it's a visual I wanted to share with you. Because it just helped me grasp this idea that nothing can thwart God's plan. So, ancient days, tapestry was a really big thing. So these huge weavings, some of them would cover entire walls, very similar to stained glass. You do stories, right? Bible stories, or you show some form of art. And here's the deal with the tapestry. This is the back of it. It's just kind of chaos. There's loose strings. There's some vague imagery, but it just doesn't make a lot of sense. And I think this is how we view our own lives. Like this happened and that happened. And I want my life to be beautiful. I want it to make sense, but it just seems chaotic. What you have to do is you have to flip it over. And when you flip it over, there was some sort of purpose in all those loose threads. What seemed so unclear and so confusing, actually, there's some sort of redemptive element. And I'll tell you what, Joseph, while he was rejected, imprisoned in slavery, you're just looking at the backside of the tapestry. And you're thinking, God, I don't get it. When you're looking at your life, I don't get it, God. This is chaos. This makes no sense. There is this concept that nothing thwarts God's plans. And on the other side of it, God is making something that only he can see. And he doesn't cause everything, but he takes everything. And he says, let me redeem that. Let me take that wound. Let me heal it. Let it be a scar. Because I'm not going to let anything thwart my plans for your life. Would you pray with me? Lord, I know for all my friends who are in this room, my friends who are watching or listening, oh, Lord, life can be hard. There are stories and there are wounds, and some of our wounds, they are so close to the surface. And we've been stuck. Haven't known how to heal. But God, none of us want to stay wounded because we believe in this extraordinary God who takes dead things and brings them back to life, who resurrects, who makes new. And God, I pray that we would bring our wounds to you, the things that seem purposeless, the things that seem so out of our control. And God, would you teach us how to make decisions in the midst of our pain? We could be responsible for how we react. That God, you would be doing things where you're closing up wounds and creating scars. You're teaching us how to forgive unforgivable things. And Lord, I pray that we would not be a community of wounded people, but a people who are moving towards healing in scars. And in the midst of it, you are there. We're not alone. In the name of Jesus, we pray this. Amen. Amen. Hey, thanks everybody for walking through that. As you go, just a couple of thoughts. One, if you need a Bible, if you want to know more about who Jesus is, if you're here in the room, go to the Welcome Center. I've got a Bible for you, and there's people up front that can pray with you about anything or help you follow Jesus. If you're online, click on the appropriate buttons. God bless you guys. Be the hands and feet and mouthpiece of Jesus. You're loved.